In life, it is often said that existence precedes essence. Meaning isn't something we're born with. It is something we create through the lives we lead and the choices that we make. Yet if that is true, why does history have such an uncanny habit of repeating itself? Nations go to war, civilizations rise and fall. People inherit the mistakes of those who came before them, convinced that they will achieve a different outcome. And despite this, we continue to hope. Hope that tomorrow might finally be different. Hope that humanity can become something greater than what it is today. When I was a kid, I'd heard of a game called Xenogears that people talked about across message boards as being the greatest game there ever was. At that time, I couldn't imagine there being a JRPG better than Final Fantasy VII, but it was also made by Squaresoft, so I had high expectations. Sadly, as I lived in Australia, I was never able to get my hands on it when it released, and wasn't able to play it until much later. Having since played several of the Xenoblade games, I wanted to return to where it all began. The earliest expression of Tetsuya Takahashi's grand vision, searching for the philosophical threads that will continue weaving their way through his work for decades to come. Perhaps that's fitting. History, after all, has a habit of repeating itself. So let's take a look at Xenogears, and whether it's worth the hype. I played the version released on the Sony PlayStation by Squaresoft in 1998, which sadly never reached PAL regions. We awaken in the shoes of Fei Fong Wong, an amnesiac artist who resides in the frontier village of Lahan, a quaint and quiet settlement where days are spent farming, painting, and worrying about what mischief the local kids are getting up to. On this day, we learn that it is the eve of a wedding between two of Fei's closest friends. And whilst Fei does have his reservations about the match, owing to some feelings of his own, he agrees to assist with the preparations. Stepping into Fei's shoes, one of the first things that struck me was the presentation of the game. Characters are beautifully animated 2D sprites wandering across a rotatable 3D environment. It immediately gave Xenogears a sense of scale that felt unlike many of its contemporaries. A design that accommodates big set pieces without having to eat up disk space with flashy cinematic cutscenes. One of the first little details that charmed me was the simple fact that Fei can jump, which was a little out of the ordinary for 2D story-heavy JRPGs of this ilk. In his basement, I thought it would be funny to jump into a random spiderweb, and was surprised to find the silken thread appear in my inventory after connecting with it. Stepping outside and making my way to a community centre. Wait, is that Luca? And when talking to a guide, it seemed as though he always found a way to ensure that he was looking directly at me as the player, irrespective of what angle I approached him from. Even everyday NPCs can jabber about their lives and fate, and you can just walk away from it all before they even have a chance to finish what they were going to say. Having grown up loving Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, I couldn't help but smile seeing so much of their DNA woven into this game. It felt familiar and safe, something that I needed to wrap myself up into, like a warm blanket on a rainy day. Slowly, I settled into the familiar rhythm that so many JRPGs establish during their opening hours. The game imposed on me a sense of comfort, like the sensation of stepping up on a plush rug in bare feet. And then, everything changes when you step upon something sharp enough to draw blood. The tonal whiplash is immediate and deeply unsettling. And that's the thing I found with Xenogears in general. It doesn't want you to get a safe sense of complacency. It wants you to struggle. It wants you to feel uncomfortable. And in many ways, that discomfort became the defining characteristic of my entire experience with the game. Returning from Citan's mountain home, I expected to resume the quiet preparations for the wedding. Instead, I was met with a battlefield. Lahan had become collateral damage in a war between Avet and Kislev, giant gears tearing through the very village that, only moments earlier, had felt so peaceful. Before Fei even has the time to process what is going on, the groom is shot dead before his eyes, and this sends him into a fractured state. Not quite himself, Fei enters a gear that sits vacantly nearby and uses it to take out the enemy. But right when he sees victory, he is pushed past breaking point and his gear creates a detonation that obliterates the entire village, the bride dissipating in beautiful ethereal light. Feared and left responsible for what happened to the village, Fei is asked to leave, and it's here where the adventure shifts. Where we had begun as a tale of collecting items for a celebration, we are now desperately trying to hold on to frayed lines that are unravelling, like the gossamer threads of a once beautiful wedding dress. The narrative moves to something a little deeper and darker, which matches the atmosphere of the Black Moon Forest, where we first make contact with Elly, a woman whom Fei knows the name of, despite never having met her before. Whilst the mystery kept on compounding, I found myself feeling a bit disconnected from the experience and not enjoying it. It was as though the trauma had directly been inflicted upon me. Few games have made me feel this uncomfortable. The closest comparison I can draw is Persona 3, where we are forced to watch teenagers repeatedly emulate shooting themselves to invoke an inner demon. Part of the discomfort came from the narrative itself. I wasn't always in control of Fei's actions, and there were moments I found myself questioning the decisions that he made that I had no say in. But that emotional disconnect was compounded by something else. The game itself often felt like it was resisting me. Its controls, camera, and mechanics would become a recurring source of frustration, especially when the stakes were high. When walking the fields and being drawn into battle, I noted that they took a page from the flowing poetic book of Chrono Cross by having characters able to attack with a weak, strong, or fierce stance, which combo into each other through the use of ability points, or AP. As you experiment with this, you can unlock death blows, which are devastating finishes that make battles a breeze. In fact, combat never felt difficult. If anything, it felt repetitive and mechanical, because you could just use the same combos on every encounter to ensure victory. That's basically foot combat in a nutshell. However, Xenogears wouldn't be the game it is without gear combat, and this was one of the more frustrating elements of the game for me. Where characters improve through traditional leveling, gears are instead governed entirely by their equipment. Where the challenge came from for me was not putting the controller down in frustration, and pushing on, because underneath it all there is really a compelling story. It just isn't told in the best way when it comes to its gameplay. This was also echoed in many of the dungeons. Take for example the Avec waterways. It felt like an endless segment of swimming upstream against a current that would sometimes push you away. Eventually I just had to stop asking myself whether I was enjoying the game and focus on reaching the end of this segment. And this became a recurring motive. Some of the dungeons that put you into long stretches in gears were also frustrating, as these are governed by how much fuel you have remaining, and if you run out of fuel, your gears are basically useless in battle. I didn't like this and wish the game had a few more dungeons of exploring as your characters, rather than relying so heavily on the gears, but I guess the game is not called Xenofoot. If Xenogears asks what it means to be human, then its party provides many of the answers if you look closely enough. Each character embodies a different facet of the human condition, and together they form the fraying threads of a tapestry that weave into Fei's own struggle to understand himself. His fractured identity draws heavily from Freudian psychology, most obviously through id, while also echoing Jung's ideas of integrating the fragmented self. Elly becomes the emotional thread binding the game's many cycles together. Across countless lifetimes, she represents belonging, compassion, and the possibility that history need not always end the same way. Satan is a man of conviction and loyalty, but despite this is torn between duty and a curiosity to explore beyond the bounds of what it is that he has been directed to do. Bart represents the enduring spirit and hope for a better future. His determination to restore both his homeland and its people reflects an admirable desire to create something better than the world he inherited. Rico is a motif of isolation and alienation, and despite the odds set against him as a demi-human, he has made something of himself, showing that even at humanity's worst point, there is always hope. And then you have Billy, who presents blind faith, and how following an edict implicitly can be harmful without understanding the ideals that faith was originally meant to uphold. His initial obedience highlights the danger of institutions becoming disconnected from their founding ideals, and the lower-ranked members having no knowledge of this fracture. I felt that the characters early on all showed a relatable aspect of humanity, and encapsulated the fractured shards of a god's psyche attempting to pull itself back together. Unfortunately, that emotional investment began to fade with the later additions to the party. It wasn't that Choo Choo, Maria, and Emeralda lacked interesting ideas. Rather, the game's focus was already beginning to shift by the time that they joined the party. Xenogears became increasingly fascinated with expanding its world building, often at the expense of exploring the people inhabiting it. It's a shame because while their stories hint at fascinating ideas, a character comprised entirely of nanomachines, hello, they never received the same level of exploration as the earlier cast members. Xenogears is overflowing with creativity, but not every idea is equally suited to the experience that it's trying to create. For starters, it went the safe road by relegating combat to random encounters. I say safe loosely and directed only at the developers, because I certainly didn't feel assured. The random encounter rate was so erratic that I could never quite make sense of it. One moment, you would go for a whole screen without encountering a single enemy, and the next, if you even so much as went to open the menu, open a door, or even change the camera angle, you would be plunged immediately into combat. And don't get me started on the sections of the game that ask you to navigate platforming as well as aligning the camera, all whilst you could still get into a random encounter. Yes, needless to say, Babel Tower was not a fun experience, and now I understand the consensus of why this is. I think that one of the weaknesses of the game was the inclusion of platforming. And it goes with a lot of the ideas that seem to be randomly thrown into the cornucopia that is Xenogears. That web that you could obtain by jumping into in the early game, besides one other location that I can think of, also early in game, this is never encountered again. The game tends to like the idea of something, but has poor execution in its implementation. I don't know if this comes down to the 2-year development cycle that Square supposedly imposed on all development projects, or if the team truly had too many ideas to fit into one game, and rather than focus on a few strong ones, thin them out, which resulted in them becoming frustrations for players, rather than something charming and memorable. Babel Tower is the kind of section that makes me wonder whether every idea needs to make it into the final product. For a world built upon centuries of war, Xenogears constantly rewards curiosity. Every settlement feels culturally distinct, every nation carries its own history, and beneath the fantasy aesthetic lies a slowly emerging science fiction narrative that quietly recontextualizes everything that you thought you knew. You begin in the humble village of Lahan, nestled beneath gently sloping hills where simple brick homes, ploughed fields, and wandering cattle paint the picture of an ordinary farming community. More pronounced is the capital of Avet, Vladivik, which is a jewel amidst the golden sands of the desert. A city perched atop a vast stone plateau, crowned by its castle, while homes cascade down the surrounding slopes to the desert sands below. And then you have the religious city of Nisan, built around a tranquil lake, its cathedral resting upon a solitary rock rising from the water, home of the Holy Mother. Each settlement possesses its own identity, and its people reflect that through their dialogue, beliefs, and the way they carry themselves. What I loved most was how Xenogears slowly peeled away its fantasy facade to reveal the science fiction lurking beneath. The deeper I ventured into its world, the more I realised that everything I'd accepted at face value was only one layer of a much larger truth. Much like Fei himself, the world isn't quite what it first appears to be. The irony is that the more fascinated I became with the world, the more I found myself wrestling with actually playing the game. I desperately wanted to see where the story was heading, but there were times when the gameplay threatened to get in the way of that journey. And this brings me to the infamous second disc. I have seen many people disparaging the second disc, claiming that it prevents Xenogears from becoming the masterpiece that it could have been. But here is where I find myself at odds with the wider consensus. I actually quite liked it. After spending hours wrestling with mechanics that seemed determined to slow my progress, there was something strangely comforting about simply being invited to sit down and listen as a lone narrator calmly recounted the events that had unfolded, whilst a crucifix gently swung back and forth in the background. For the first time in hours, I wasn't worrying about the next random encounter, lining up an awkward jump, running out of fuel, or whether I had remembered to upgrade a gear. I could simply sit back, breathe, and absorb the story that Xenogears had been trying to tell all along. The text-heavy presentation of the second disc, whilst yes, made the game feel like it was over-ambitious and rushed in the end, also gave me a sense of relief. It was the perfect way to wind the game down after the many segments that had overstayed their welcome. Ironically, the section that represents Xenogears' greatest production compromise was also the section where I finally felt the game stopped fighting against me. For the first time, it simply trusted its story to carry me to the end. Yasunori Mitsuda delivers another beautiful score with leitmotifs that weave their way through the entire adventure. That feeling of coziness I mentioned earlier was amplified by the track Our Village is Number 1, which lulls you into a sense of false security, only to pull the rug out from under you before you've even had the chance to settle into its warmth. Tracks such as The One Who Is Torn Apart and Premonition don't simply accompany the narrative, they foreshadow it. Long before the game reveals its larger truths, Mitsuda's music quietly hints that something ancient and unknowable lies beneath the surface. For a game of this scope, however, I couldn't help but wish there was more variety. Many pieces of music recur frequently, and by the latter half of the adventure, some emotional moments begin to lose their impact simply because I'd already heard the accompanying music so many times before. Presentation, however, is another story. Despite my frustrations with controlling the camera during gameplay, there is an undeniable artistry to the way Xenogears directs it during its story sequences. There were countless moments where I simply stopped to admire how carefully each shot had been composed. A few that come to mind are the Yggdrasil being pulled out of the sand and thrown at Bart's gear, or even smaller pieces such as the Yggdrasil lifting into a port. The animated cutscenes were also nice, though the dub was not at all synced with the lip movements, and did pull me a little out of the moment. It is very much a product of its era, and whilst it occasionally gave me some discomfort, it never diminished the sincerity of what the game was trying to communicate. Despite any issues Xenogears may have suffered during development, there's never a moment where it feels as though its creators stopped striving toward the vision they set out to realize. So after all that, is Xenogears worth playing? I think that depends on what you're looking for. If you are after a tightly paced JRPG with polished mechanics, intuitive level design, and gameplay that consistently rewards your time, then honestly, probably not. There were many moments where Xenogears tested my patience. I wrestled with its platforming, its erratic encounter rate, the awkward localization, and mechanics that often felt as though they were actively working against me. More than once I found myself wondering whether I even wanted to keep playing. And yet, every time I reached that point, Xenogears quietly whispered another question. Who is Fei? Why does Elly feel so familiar? Why does history continue to repeat itself? What does it actually mean to be human? Those questions kept pulling me forward long after the gameplay had exhausted me. Looking back now, I don't think Xenogears is the masterpiece in the conventional sense. It's too uneven, too ambitious, too willing to sacrifice accessibility in pursuit of ideas that often reach far beyond what the PlayStation was ever capable of presenting. But perhaps that's also why it has endured. It isn't remembered because it was perfect. It's remembered because it dared to ask questions that few games before it had the confidence to ask. And because nearly 3 decades later, we are still trying to answer them. At the beginning of this review, I spoke about humanity's tendency to repeat itself. We inherit the triumphs and mistakes of those who came before us, forever striving toward a future that seems just beyond our reach. In many ways, Xenogears embodies that very philosophy. It stumbles, it overreaches, it bears the scars of an impossible development cycle. But it never stops striving towards the vision its creators believed in. Even when it falls short, there is something profoundly human about refusing to abandon that dream. Perhaps that's why Xenogears has stayed with me. Not because I loved every moment I spent playing it. Not because I think it's the greatest JRPG ever made. But because long after I put the controller down, I was still thinking about it. And maybe that's the greatest compliment I can give any work of art. By the way, did this game hook you because it was something different, or are you just a philosophical thespian? Let me know in the comments. This has been Venoir with a review of Xenogears for the Sony PlayStation. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe for more great JRPG content. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch my videos. I appreciate you. Take care of yourselves, and bye bye for now.